You are Stan Elmore.
Yeah, I are Stan Elmore.
You are?
Yes.
So, tell me, so you were born in Colorado, correct?
I didn't hear you.
Were you Colorado? So tell me about Colorado and what you remember.
Oh, what do I remember?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I was very young at the time. But my mother remembered the first part of my life as the most enjoyable part that she had ever had in her life. She says, I said, is she, what part of where you lived and different things you enjoyed? The first year that I was alive, when I was born in Denver at a hospital.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't fall out under a tree or something.
Yeah.
And she remembered that, and she had a lot of pictures of me when cameras were pretty crude and simple at that point. And there was good light in Colorado because you get up high and so pretty good pictures, almost 100 years old, those pictures are. And but I don't remember much of that. That stuff.
So what was your first memory?
Yeah, and I started school in Missouri.
Mm-hmm.
Miss Hitt was my first teacher. I always remember her for her name in Houston.
Anything memorable from that class?
Not too much. I remembered because my parents told me but I had. I was a good student in first grade. There was no kindergarten in those days. Mm-hmm. And Miss Hitt was taking the place of my mother. Mm. And my mother told me, I don't remember that, but my mother told me that I called Miss Hitt my mother, of 6 years old, and started to identify with other people. Mm-hmm. And I went through 4 years in Houston school. And then the world was all messed up because we were having a war at that point. Mm-hmm. So my dad couldn't get a job. So he had tried to he'd gone out of town a couple times. Never found anything that would work. The last one that he gave up on was in Utah. They were building some kind of military facility, and so he went to there in the winter.
Oh, wow!
And he only stayed probably less than a week. It was so cold a carpenter couldn't. You have to use your hands to do carpenter work, and he couldn't cut it, so he came back to Missouri.
Okay, so where was he then?
He was in Utah, north of the capital. Okay. So where out it was where they had enough land to build some kind of a military base of some kind. I don't know anything at all about that. Mm-hmm. So. he had worked some in Denver, but you couldn't do work in Denver because the war effort took all the supplies and material, and you couldn't build water lines and power lines and things like that. But he did work in Denver a little bit. He had a cousin who was a building inspector, and he did a lot of networking with other people to find it. But those jobs didn't pay very well, and they ended quick. And so he had worked at Evans Ranch prior to the war, and he was a cowpuncher, really. Rode a horse, had a rifle in beside the saddle. They shot some elk that went. Then the elk, but they contacted a federal person, and the elk went all to Denver, where they cut them up, and they gave the meat for the elk to welfare people who. And I've got a picture sitting on an elk. I was, I think, 4, and I was sitting about this high. My feet didn't reach the ground.
So like this high up?
Yeah, well, about this high. When an elk's laying down, they kind of settle out, and we'll get those out sometime. But we have a lot of pictures. My mother had she kept all the pictures that she had, and they couldn't eat any of that elk because it belonged to the federal government, and I don't think they got paid. But they did cut. It seemed like they didn't pay much attention. I don't know where it was slaughtered, where the elk was slaughtered, but I do know that they saved the tongue in the elk, and we saved the tongues on beef cattle when we were back in Missouri, and the tongue is about this thick, real, and you can slice them off, and it kind of looks like lunch meat. And I remember eating tongue, slice them up, make sandwiches in Missouri. We didn't have any elk, but we had a lot of cattle.
No elk tongue.
Yeah, and we ate the tongue. And people in Missouri just thought that was a little strange. But they had, when they'd slaughtered the elk, and so he got up in the morning, put his rifle in the saddle, and it's got a scabbard on the side, and he had a pistol that he carries with it. I think maybe sometimes they would shoot the beaver that we're making. They'd make dams in the little valleys. I mean really little valleys, like 200 foot wide. Didn't have much place for cattle to feed because the beavers would build beaver dams and dam up the water and flood it, and that kills the grass. So he carried dynamite in his saddlebag, and then they would throw the dynamite into the beaver dams, blow them up, to drain the water out.
Yeah.
That was part of his job. And so he looked like John Wayne running around in his pictures. And we don't have many pictures of him because he's out working, and my mother had the only camera we had. She's taking pictures of me because I was cute. And after I came along, Mother, who was a chambermaid, that helped the rich lady get dressed, get the clothing out, and that sort of thing. So she was a real servant.
Okay.
And they lived in Denver in a big house that the people didn't even own. They just rented the house. It was about 2 or 3 stories high. And they would have very large parties because Mr. Mayo was he was connected to the diplomatic corps, and he traveled in Europe. And they had to give parties for important rich people in Denver. And they would hire just hire a bunch of waiters from restaurants or big facilities in Denver, and the house was in Denver. And my dad was the butler, and he took care of Mr. Mayo would drink too much, and he drink as much as he needed. My dad would cut him off and feed him something that he couldn't get drunk on. And that was during Prohibition.
Oh wow!
And alcohol was illegal, and they had a loading dock, an unloading dock on this big house in Denver. My dad said he unloaded whole truckloads of Canadian whiskey. Denver is not too far from Canada, so they would bring them in, back them up to the loading dock, and unload in that house. And
this was in the 1930s, right, or 1920s?
I was born in 33.
33.
This was before that.
Oh, so before that.
Before that, he was a butler, which was kind of real excited because he got that job because he spoke English very well, and I think there were 9 servants in the family, and they lived in the rental house in Denver. They didn't go anywhere else.
So they lived in that house in Denver.
Yeah.
Okay.
And when Mr. Mayo and his wife were there, they lived there. But when he was traveling in Europe, she lived in the house in Evergreen, which was very near to Highway 70.
Yeah.
70 wasn't there at that point. And so they had a Russian chauffeur who drove a car, and they had a big Duesenberg, which was an American car, not a overseas car, and he would take my dad for a ride. They'd run into Denver to buy something, and so there was a Russian chauffeur. There was a lady who took care of their dogs. She was from Canada. There were no other American servants for their house in the mountains, and it had they had an architect come from Europe and lived with them for a year to figure out, so he could learn what they wanted in their house. And the house had solid rock native rock. They trimmed down the lot, and there's the rock. They just left it there on the floor, and chipped it off so you can walk on it. And then there was a big white polar bear rug in the middle of the living room floor.
Wow.
And it's very, very impressive. And your mother and I stopped and talked to them. They still lived in the house.
Wow.
In Denver, or the wife did. And so there was a Canadian lady took care of the dogs. My dad was, he wasn't a butler up there. Up there he was kind of like the handyman to cut ice off the pond, store it with sawdust in a that's the way you had ice.
No refrigeration.
In the 30s. Yeah, that's right. And they celebrated. They had people come and visit with them.
It's kind of like Downton Abbey for people who may not know what this was like.
Yeah, well, they were pretty relaxed. They didn't. They weren't. It wasn't fancy up there. It was a mountain cabin.
Okay.
But it's very big.
Very big.
So we went up and visited the people who were there, and I don't think it was the Mayos. And Oliver and Dorothy were on their way to go to California to teach, and we rendezvoused to meet with them, and they looked at the house.
Wow.
And I've got a nice set of pictures, like 8x10s that they made when they were up there taking care of the house. And I can't remember. I guess they had to have a cook. They had a French cook. That's what.
So a French cook.
And I don't remember how many servants that were available, but it was a whole bunch of people.
So let's jump to the end of World War II. What do you remember around that time?
To the end of World War II.
Yeah. So you were in San Diego, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
We were in San Diego when my dad came back from Utah because it was too cold. He looked for a job, and he always I would ask him, well, now what kind of, is it warm down there? And he said they always referred to the weather in San Diego as a Mediterranean, because that was a popular thing to say.
Yeah.
And so my mother worked in the aircraft factory, and she used a punch press to punch holes in things. You just pull some down and pull the trigger, and she wasn't a strong kind of person at that point. And they took her off of that, and she did paperwork. She was scheduled. They came by her house. We live very close to the aircraft factory, Roar Aircraft, and they picked her up in a station wagon at 4 o'clock in the morning.
Wow.
And they had charts with graphs on them that told them. Then they handed that out to the people that were making airplanes, and it told them what kind of parts to make for that date and how many of them.
Yeah.
So that at the end, they bring all the parts together and it makes an airplane. And then, so they would bring her home around in the company car about noon. I think she worked
4 a.m. to noon.
for the aircraft company.
Okay.
The private company made the planes. And it wasn't they weren't federal employees or anything. So she did that paperwork all that time, and then you had to hustle for food. Yeah, there was a butcher shop close to where we lived. Well, they would find people who were raising like rabbits. A lot of people ate rabbits.
Wow.
Because there wasn't there weren't any cattle to butcher. It was all went to the military to feed them. Because all the military, they all were moved away from home to train to be soldiers and sailors and do whatever. So everybody was involved. And my dad, for a little while, he made concrete boats. We were in San Diego, of course, and they were trying to get tankers to take petroleum products into the Pacific Ocean to bases that were there. Of course, the Japs had already shot up Hawaiian Islands, so there wasn't a lot of war at that point. But people trained there, and then every night searchlights waved into the air. They'd find an airplane that was flying where they shouldn't be, and the searchlights would zip on them and find them. And once they'd hit them with one light, 2 or 3 more would go across the sky, and they're stuck, and they can't get out of that. And then they land. It's just somebody who wasn't supposed to be up there. But that happened nearly every night. And
nation was on edge.
And then quite a bit. They caught Japanese people who had 2-way radios in their basement, who were talking to Japanese submarines just off the coast. And then they rounded all the Japanese people up and put them in camps. There was nobody complained about that being. It was kind of like putting them in jail, but it was. They weren't guarded with guns or anything. But you read articles about that in the paper. Paper was pretty well talking about the war. And so when I was in the 5th, 6th, 7th grade, and I've got my. Did I show you my yearbook from I was in junior high?
I don't think so.
And then I came back to Missouri and went to the 8th grade in Houston, Missouri. So I just went to school there for 3 years.
So, do you remember the end, like your memories around the end of World War II? I think you had told me about you were listening to a baseball game.
Oh yeah, we were. My dad was building houses, and I pulled nails out of they were reusing lumber from crates. 1944. On Saturday, they there wasn't anybody in San Diego who grew up there.
Mm-hmm.
They were from Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, Missouri.
Yeah.
Because there were no jobs, and they had to go where they could get a job, and of course they all were ready to do their part to win the war, but they had to go where the work was.
Yeah.
So that's where people moved a lot, and I went to and when it was, they had been there for I think a year or so, and I went to St. Louis. Somebody took me to visit my aunt, and they had made arrangements for my mother's sister to take me to the train station, and they had a place where someone would check you in, put you on a train, went from St. Louis to Kansas City, and there visitors aid, and I think I was 9. That's what I'm remembering.
Yeah.
It may have been a year off. And they met me and gave me a sandwich, and then they walked me and put me on a train. And if you were a civilian getting on a civilian train, they move you off the side,
Yeah.
take it, and then they let troop ships go, or troop trains go through, where they would train people in like Fort Leonard Wood, trained to be soldiers, and then they'd ship them out, and to get to the coast, in the East Coast, then their trains had priority.
Yeah.
So everybody else's train pulls them off on the siding, and troop trains go through. So I went from Kansas City to Los Angeles.
Wow.
I think in the same train. Didn't get lost or anything. Had a little bit of money, and I could buy sandwiches. And I didn't go to the dining room, and it wasn't elegant or everything. It was very plain. And when I got to Los Angeles, the visitor or the people who were supposed to meet the train was late because they couldn't keep their schedules.
Yeah.
And so I'm wandering around in the depot at 9 years old in Los Angeles. I didn't know where to go, and they didn't meet me. And then the conductor or somebody who was wandering around, he just finished his shift. They put me on a train to go to Denver, to go to San Diego. Yeah, I knew I was going to San Diego, and it was just all soldiers.
Yeah. Wow. So you're in a train with all soldiers.
All soldiers, and they fed me everything I needed.
Wow.
Which I thought was cute. I didn't have to pay for that.
And this was in the middle of the war.
That's right, 1944.
Yeah. 9-year-old you with a bunch of basically graduate.
Yeah, they were just most of them were just out of high school, and so I'm rolling along down there, and I didn't worry too much. When you're 9 years old, you don't worry about bombs and crazy stuff or being lost.
Yeah.
And there was not a lot of, there weren't as many hoodlums, I don't think, on the streets as they are now today in the United States.
You were less worried.
Yeah, I wasn't worried too much. And then and the next thing I'm I'm sitting in the car, train car, looking out to San Diego. Never been there before. And I looked out the window, and there was my dad. And he dressed pretty good when he wasn't working on construction. He had a suit and tie on.
Suit and tie.
And I was very happy, and they were too, because I was a day late.
Wow.
They didn't have no idea where I was.
No cell phones to call you.
No cell phones, and that was pretty cool, and it was in the summertime. And then, so I had to go start to school. I was the 5th grade. So they didn't have any schools.
Yeah.
So they had a housing project. So the teachers stood in the hallway. The hall goes down, and then they could see in 3 bedrooms.
Wow.
From the middle of the hall. So they had to sit there because there was just one teacher. They're very short on teachers, and they could keep control of 5th graders.
In 3 different rooms.
In three rooms.
That would be crazy.
In a house.
So not a school room where it's just one room. It was a hallway with 3 doors.
Yeah,
wow.
yeah, and they were built for housing. And then they would, there was in the 5th and 6th grade, I guess about the 2nd year, then I went into a brand new building that was 6th grade. And then that book that I've got in there is a 7th grade, and it was a regular yearbook. By then they had teachers, and it was a little more stable. Yeah. And of course, the war was over. Yeah. And then people had to figure out what they're going to do. Go back home, stay in California, and we lived in Chula Vista. The slang for Chula Vista today is Chulawana, because we were just 10 miles from Mexico.
Oh yeah, because San Diego is close to Mexico.
Yeah, 10 miles.
Yeah.
And then we would drive across there to buy gas for your car. Folks had a car.
Into Mexico?
Into Mexico. Because, and you had a sticker in your car.
Wow.
And you could tear off. You got some coupons, and you could tear them off. And you could buy gas, but it was very limited.
Yeah.
So you go into Mexico, and you could buy gas there.
Wow.
And but you don't have any coupons to keep track of it, to keep you honest.
Yeah.
So one guy would, an old the pumps to run gas, you had to crank them, and it would crank. You go like 5 gallons, and you get 5 gallons, and this guy would stand there and make sure nobody'd see him, and he'd crank it back, and then they'd make you pay for whatever you bought, and maybe some more, because you can't keep track of it.
Yeah.
But you don't care what it costs, as long as it filled up the tank.
Yeah.
So we went across at Tijuana. It was where we went one time to Ensenada, which is about 50 miles, and went fishing. And I caught a fish about that big. And Rod Satterley's son is in Ensenada today.
Wow.
You can drive right across the border, and a lot of people go down there. Food's a little cheaper.
Yeah.
Janet's uncle, what the heck was his name? Anyway, he went fishing down there during the war.
Wow.
And well, of course, they lived in California.
Yeah.
And his car broke down while he was down there, and he trusted a Mexican to take care of the car and put it back together, and call him. He lived in Los Angeles. Yeah. That's Hank.
Hank, yeah.
And he's retired, yeah. But he lives in Los Angeles now.
So, let's jump to high school. So you're in Houston for high school, right?
Yeah, eighth grade.
8th grade through.
And then the next year, I'm first year of high school, 4 year.
4 year.
Yeah. And this was a consolidated school. Mm-hmm. It had, the people. Most of the people lived on farms.
Yeah.
And it didn't build any new houses during World War II. And the farm and the people had consolidated high school, and then they had school buses, and they hauled everybody to town. And they kind of do the same thing right now.
Yeah. So did you take the school bus?
I rode in a school bus. Mm-hmm. And the bus would go. It would go one way, and then at night it'd turn around and go back the other way. Uh-huh. But they would rotate it, so not everybody would have to ride it
as long.
for a long time, and it was very, very, very well organized. And there were a lot of buses. Mm-hmm. It was a large school, and they created football. I think maybe last year I was high school.
So just your last year of high school, they created football for that school?
Yeah. At one of the years when I was in high school, they didn't like when my dad was there. They had basketball, but they didn't play football. Oh. So about halfway through, and there were a lot of Elmore boys. Mm-hmm. Not in my family, but in my. It was my dad's uncle, and he had 5 boys. Mm-hmm. So when the last boy finished high school, they had the Elmore basketball team play the high school. I don't know whether they beat the high school or not. But it was they were very famous. They were great, and they were also good football. Mm-hmm.
What was one of the most memorable moments in high school?
In high school?
Yeah, something memorable.
Well, we had a big study hall.
Big study hall.
Study hall, and the library was in there. And the doors were locked. We couldn't come in, so we would come in and get off the bus. We'd walk up and we'd wait there. And it's on the top floor of high school, and underneath was a place where they had special programs. I don't know what you call it, but it was. And they would take the chairs all out. They played basketball down there.
So it was like an auditorium / basketball.
Yeah, but up on that top floor was the library.
Okay.
The library had 2 doors, and they opened up, and they were locked at night. Janitor would come in, clean everything, and there were some people who were kind of they wanted to not have a smooth running day. They were mischievous.
Yeah.
So we fixed it so if you pull the doors, they still were locked. Yeah. So we took the pins out of the hinges, and they're on the outside. So there's 2 3-foot doors, and the doors pulled out in the hallway, put on top of somebody. And I remember the librarian was just a little skinny little lady. She didn't know what to do.
Yeah.
And then they were trying to figure out who did the bad things.
You didn't do it, right?
And I don't remember doing that. But I probably was with a group that did it. And then and in the study hall, we had radiators, just like you would see, this high.
The big old radiator.
Yeah, and people put Limburger cheese on the radiator, and it stunk.
Yeah.
You have Limburger cheese?
I don't think I have.
You haven't had it? No. It kind of smelled like poop.
Oh. So put that on the radiator and make the whole room smell?
Yeah, the whole room smelled like Limburger cheese. And but there it was big. There were 100 kids in it.
Wow.
But most people were fairly good. There wasn't not too much mischievous stuff going on. And then we'd eat lunch in the gym. Had seats where you could watch and people play basketball, and then we could get milk in a little square thing.
Yeah.
I think they still sell milk.
Square carton?
Yeah.
Wow. So that
And then I would trade my ham. We had ham on the farm.
Okay.
My ham sandwich for a bologna sandwich.
You like bologna?
Well, I didn't have a chance to eat it at home because we didn't have bologna.
You only had ham.
So I'd trade food back and forth, and then trade milk. And I had a problem with milk because I couldn't digest it.
Yeah.
And that problem suffered me until I got in. I got in Panama. I was in the Army.
So you graduated high school.
Yes.
So how did you end up in Panama? Kind of tell that.
With what?
How did you end up in Panama?
Well, I got a letter from a friend, President Truman.
Yeah.
It said that I was supposed to show up and serve my country. I got drafted.
You got drafted.
And I was working for the highway department as a surveyor.
Yeah.
and then I checked with some people who had gone into the military before I did, like 6 months, and found out what kind of schools they had. I thought, well, like I'm a surveyor. I'd like to learn to be a surveyor better. And so I went to basic training in Arkansas, and you take a lot of tests in the Army to see they're trying to figure out where to put the guys. And I was very good at taking tests. So and they asked me, well, what are you gonna do? And I said, well, I'd like to go to surveying school.
Yeah.
And this was a guy who had been drafted out of college when he had finished college.
Yeah.
So they used people who knew how to read and write, I guess. And so he says, I never heard of a school like that. And then he found one in Virginia, and I'm in Arkansas.
Okay.
And he said, well, let's see what they've got. And there's 2 or 3 kinds of surveying. And I got in a school where I was supposed to be learning how to survey. Well, I'd worked for 2 years for the highway department.
Yeah.
I knew how to survey. So, and when you do surveying work, and then they had 20 people in our class. Half of them were college graduates because they assumed that if you had gone to school and you have a civil engineering degree, you'd be a good surveyor. They aren't together. So in our 20 people, there were 2 people who had really done surveying. I was one, and there was another guy who he wasn't just drafted. He was sent there because he was working to train other people to be surveying in North Carolina, and we were in Fort Belvoir, which was in Virginia. And so he and I buddied up. We're supposed to everybody pick a friend, so your grades in this class was half surveying, setting up equipment, turning angles, measuring them, add them all up, real surveying. And then the other half was we did a lot of math. We had to learn about star shots of shooting stars and turning angles, and then the best way to calculate all those was with logarithms. And logarithms we had 7. I think we had 7 grades of logarithms, and did you ever study logarithms?
A little bit. I wasn't good at it.
Yeah, and it's just you have to study a lot. So when I went into that school, the guy said, and more than half of my class was college graduates. And he says, and you haven't been to college. How did you get in this class? And I kind of explained a little bit to him that I suggested it. And, well, he said, we're going to put you in there because that's somebody else decided. And so he said, if you don't make it, you're going to turn in your survey equipment, and we're going to give you a rifle. So I believed him, and gosh, I didn't want to be in the infantry. And so I went to the library every night and studied those logarithms. I had studied that in high school, but I didn't practice. I did it, and
so you made sure you passed that class.
Well, our first this was a, I don't know how long, this was a 10 or 20 day school, and there were 20 of us in the class. Over half were college graduates. Some of those guys were just getting out of college, and they'd been making good grades. They were grade hogs. The first 3 weeks they graded us. Half the grade was on surveying, half of it was on mathematics and arithmetic. And who was the highest? I was the highest grade in the 20 people. And there were two guys there. One was a civil engineer and the other one was an architect. And they buddied up together, and they were fighting to see which one of them would have the highest grade out of these 20 people.
Were you surprised?
Yes, I was surprised. I had the highest grade. And then I realized that it was based on this field survey work. And they didn't know how to set up a transmitter. And I got a lot of confidence doing that. It was a neat deal. We had a big exercise field, big as a football field. And then there were lots of different schools there at the engineering school. That school closed down, and it's now at Fort Leonard Wood. Training surveyors, but there were a lot of different other kinds of. So there were about 100 or so, and we were out there in combat boots, and they lined up when they had about 10 or 12 basket. They weren't soccer balls. These were basketballs, and you kick that, and then it hit somebody else in the face. It's really hard. So 150 new recruits, and they lined us all up, and we played football kind of free, just run and kick the ball and try to get it to the other end. Several people were on the ground because they got hit in the wrong place, and it hurt a lot.
So after that school, you went to Panama. What was one of your most?
After that, I went to San Francisco.
Okay, so San Francisco.
And it was a big mapping company, and they not only did surveying, they did drawing up the maps. And complicated stuff, and they'd been working at the North Pole in Alaska to map it, and they were going to map all the way to the end of South America.
So that's how you ended up in Panama.
And we wanted to, and the Army sent me there. And actually, we had 4 companies. There was about 200 people in a company, and they didn't need but 3, and they were finishing up the work on the Arctic Circle. It was over the.
So you didn't go to the Arctic Circle, right?
And so I didn't want to go there. So there was a guy his wife was in San Francisco. He lived off base,
Yeah.
They had 2 children, and he'd been drafted because he'd finished his college, and he was deferred. A lot of people when I was in, they were all deferred from being in the service because they were in college.
Yeah.
They had a college deferment. But the minute they finished, wham, they got drafted.
Yeah.
And they didn't like being in the Army. They had a college degree. They could make big money.
Mm-hmm.
But the Army wanted them.
Mm-hmm.
So this guy was going to go to Panama.
Yeah.
I was going to Alaska.
So you were originally going to go to Alaska.
And we traded.
Oh.
I didn't go to Alaska.
You didn't go to Alaska.
I talked him into trading.
Mm-hmm.
Then he could stay in San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
When you came back from Alaska.
Mm-hmm.
When you went to Panama, you went there and stayed there till you got discharged.
Mm-hmm.
And so I said, well, and he was in a different company than I was.
Mm-hmm.
But we pulled some ideas and talked to a lot of people, and we were both smart enough to know that we could trade this, and this would be good. So I talked my way into going to Panama.
So
stayed 12 months complete.
In Panama for 12 months.
Yep.
What was one of the something crazy that happened? So I think you're obviously surveying Panama, and there's no roads, right?
There were roads, but it rained, so it's muddy, and we'd have. I had to go. I was a little more mature than some people, so I just kind of grabbed some leadership, and we go down on muddy roads, and we'd take 2 trucks, Army trucks, and we had to have chains or ropes or something. We never crossed a mud hole unless we had enough rope that we could get the first truck went through, and then he could pull the next one through. Or first truck didn't get through, and we'd have to have enough rope to pull him back out. We're in mud this deep.
Wow.
And so logistics were tough. And then there's near where we were at 73 feet, I think, where we were in old abandoned Army base, and we moved into that. They had a revolution down there, and the U.S. Army moved out of those barracks, and we didn't know it, but the president of Panama was assassinated the year before we went there.
Wow.
At the airport, not the airport, at the racetrack. They had horses, and the rich people went to watch the horses run.
Yeah.
And we had a guy who had gone to college in Europe and in Missouri and in the United States, and he had to go down there and adjust and pay off his inheritance tax.
Yeah.
Panama had their laws were all come from Spain, so the eldest son inherits everything.
Yeah.
That's the way it is in Europe. In most England, everybody is like that. Yeah. So he was down there, and somebody introduced me to him, and we'd play cards at the country club. It's nicer, and then he told me his father had been at the racetrack because his father had horses that he would take down there and run in horse races. And I thought he was maybe he was exaggerating. And he had said, well, he says, it's really tough. I had to pay my inheritance tax, and he had property there and in country of Colombia. And he says it was really tough to get $500,000 of cash without selling anything.
Wow.
In other words, he was very, very rich. And so he had a cousin or something that I knew, and he said, well, you come to the country club and we'll play poker. And so I played poker with those guys. And then
so you played poker and Panama.
Well, then he had family there.
Okay.
He had family there, and they had, one of them had a little house that wasn't very fancy, and they had a swimming pool in the backyard. It was just a hole. And there was a creek that ran through the swimming pool and out the other side, and it was just kind of clear water. And a couple of us would go there, and they would feed us. We were kind of celebrities in this little town.
Army or celebrities?
Yes.
So,
and
what's that army?
So then if you're out surveying, there's trees that what's that hard food that grows in the tropics? I don't remember. But if we're surveying, we're picking fruit off the trees and eating them, and then we kind of traveled where people didn't travel, and then there's the big mountain that's 11,000 feet, and there were two other guys and me, and on the weekend we'd get an army truck, and we'd drive up and get as close as we could get to it, and then we didn't know how to get up there because we didn't have there was places to walk, but so we never went to the top. And then it came time to do some survey observing, and whoever was in charge, or I volunteered, and I went out with my helper. He didn't go to MIT. But it was a school back east.
So it was a good college.
A good college, yes. And but I was a better surveyor. We were up there and we used guys to carry our gear up there, Panamanians, and we got up on top of the mountain, 11,400 feet, and if you tried to run from here to your car, you have to stop and take a breath because it was really tall. It was high up there. So we got up there, and we were observing. We're setting up with a surveying equipment on a tripod, and we're surveying from there to turn some angles between two other existing survey monuments. You have a little brass plaque on a concrete, I'm 18 miles away from them. And you do that at night because you can, the lights go out. Everybody turns their lights out because there's people living within that 18 miles. So we're up there and we're turning angle across from one light. We have lights that we could turn them on and off. And we have, and we communicate by radio, two-way radio. So we're up there surveying this, and it's like midnight. It's cold. 11,000 feet. It's cold. And I was the guy who ran the theodolite because I understood how I could adjust them, and I was very good at that. But I couldn't get all the angles turned because it was so cold. And I said, and then my helper, well, he was a recorder and I'm the observer. And I says, give me the book. I'll record all the angles, and you're going to have to turn them. And that's the way we finished them. And I wrote on that page, "Cold as hell," and that guy, I looked him up, and he was in a like a nursing home or something in Los Angeles. And he had a good, funny sense of humor. And he said, out there, his comment was, what happened to all the trees? Because they had cut down the trees and built subdivisions in Los Angeles, which everybody, and and I didn't look him up.
So
he's probably dead.
We all age.
Yes.
So you're in Panama, then you ended up moving back to Missouri, I'm guessing?
Yeah, well, I finished my 2 years in the military, and
where'd you go?
And I went to I walked up a gangplank. I had a duffel bag full of stuff, Samsonite suitcase full of stuff, and I'd gone to a party the night before, and I'd walked out on a porch, and it was dark as could be, and there was a little porch there with like a deck. It was concrete, and I walked off the edge, and I turned my ankles. Next thing I knew, a couple of people picked me up and carried me inside and set me down on a couch, and then they took me back to, we were off a military base. We were in civilian housing, and they x-rayed my ankle. I sprained both ankles really bad. And the next day, it's a day to go get on a boat. And so I had to go up a gangplank, it's this wide handrail, carried a duffel bag and a Samsonite suitcase. And the people in charge of the boat, sailors, everybody went down in the hole, and there's like four bunks, and I turned into sick leave. I said I may have broken my foot, so they put me in the sick bay. I didn't go in the bunks. Went in sick bay. Had sheets. They x-rayed them again, This is a big troop ship. It's pretty well. It's not really big. It was the Eldon Johnson.
Okay.
The military puts names on boats to honor people, and a really troop ship that's a big one is usually called a general.
Yeah.
I was on the Eldon Johnson. You hear people going around Cape Hatteras is on the East Coast in the Carolinas. Well, we went around there on January 2 or 3, and this boat, man, it went up and down, and I didn't have any duty.
Yeah.
So I bug out, and I would go up with another guy. We'd stand up there and watch the waves come over the front end of the boat, and then the water comes back.
Yeah.
And we're in a little room about the size of twice as big as the piano room, and we get to see it, and then the water comes over the front end about this deep, and then it goes all the way to the other end. Most everybody was working in the kitchen, making food and serving it.
Yeah.
It was a crappy place, and then we had loaded up with a bunch of they were Puerto Ricans, or they were U.S. Army.
Yeah.
But they weren't United States citizens, and they were going to Europe.
Yeah.
And they were in there downstairs in these hammocks it's in a bunk. Yeah. And they're crying and fussing. Half of them are sick and throwing up.
Yeah.
But I went on sick leave and went up there, and then I met a guy in front of the city hall down here, and I asked him, "Were you in the Army?" I thought I recognized him, and he said yes. And he was from Boone County.
Yeah.
And I think probably he passed away. He was about the same age I was. And he worked for a big farmer here in town. And that's the only guy I've ever seen that I was, he was they wouldn't let us bring any, we had places where we could sleep and cook, and then we moved along doing the surveying work to where we had to go live close to it. So we wanted a baker in this one camp.
Yeah.
And this guy was in the Army, and he was a baker. But and he had to promise that he wouldn't get in trouble. And I guess he was a black guy, but he had to the Panamanian government would not let us bring black soldiers in. Afraid we'd get in trouble. And it was just a year after these guys, they decided they didn't like the president.
Who was president?
And this is information that I got off the internet after I moved into this house. And the people were sitting at a table at the racetrack, and on one side of the table was the president.
Okay, Okay, so the president of Panama.
in Panama.
Okay.
And I read that living in this house because they hadn't told us.
They hadn't told you.
But I knew this one guy, and he said he was down there to handle his estate.
Yeah.
And then they said 3 guys came in with machine guns,
Yeah.
and they were 60.
And they shot him.
They were one on each side. They wouldn't shoot the other guy,
Okay.
and they killed the president.
Yeah.
And then they cut out.
Mm-hmm.
But this guy's father was, I think, sitting at the bar, and bullets were flying everywhere. And then and this happened in the town. I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, I think this happened very near the canal zone.
Okay.
And it'd been kind of nice if the Army had told us that had happened. And it was only a year before.
Mm-hmm.
And they closed down this barracks.
Mm-hmm.
And the Panamanian government said, we can't control that barracks. And so the military, United States military, loaded up. I don't know what they were doing up there, but they loaded up their trucks and their metal chairs that said U.S. Army on the back or U.S. Air Force.
Yeah.
And the next day, the civilians came in and picked up the buildings that they could pick up, and leaving the concrete foundations. And they stole everything. In the restaurants in town, it had said U.S. Most of it was
the place, and that's how.
And then we moved in, and we inherited that. We had a big foundation that we put all our paper in, and put 5 gallons of gasoline in there to burn it.
Oh, wow.
We kind of had a lot of fun. And then we're going to work with some islands. There's islands near the coast, and they sent us an M-boat, a landing craft, with the front drops down, and then we did ship to shore survey work. It was kind of fun. And we had 3 guys that lived on that boat. They did all their cooking. They had a lot of crappy food, and they had lots of Tabasco sauce. And they were U.S. military.
So we're gonna jump forward to Colombia. How did you meet Grandma? So Janet.
At Memorial Baptist, on the campus, there were no the dorms cafeteria didn't function on Sunday night, so all the churches would have Sunday night food for students. I was a student, she was a student, and the students had to fix the meals. And I met her at Memorial Baptist, and then she worked in the dorms, the big tall dorms, to help manage. I don't know, they had a title or something. And I had a Chevrolet convertible, and I could pull up and look up there. And she would be watching. I'd pick her up and we'd go to church. And so I met her at church.
Met her at church. Was there anything special about her?
Well, got married in Union, Missouri.
Yeah.
That's where her folks went to church.
Yeah.
So that's her hometown. And she had a wreck in her Chevrolet Corvair coming down the highway from St. Louis, because she was, at that point, she was teaching in St. Louis.
Yeah.
She was just she was teaching art, and she's driving down. I'm going to go meet her folks.
Yeah.
And she drove around a wreck or something, and somebody whacked her in the rear. And we had bought that. I went with her. She bought that car in Columbia. I guess for the year before she graduated. Yeah. And so her folks, her dad was a farmer. Actually, he'd been an ag teacher up in what's up north?
Kirksville.
Yeah. And then the MFA was opening a fertilizer plant, and they were supposed to be Union is a town that's mostly union construction.
Yeah.
And they had a guy down there building this fertilizer plant, and he quit because the unions harassed him too much. But Oliver went down and built the plant and got it running.
Wow.
And that's what he was doing. And then what did he have to do? Well, he got a job teaching down near Union, where it's people that he knew. Yeah. People that had German people that were making the food at school. Yeah. Had lots of homemade pie. And then he retired as a school teacher. I was in Columbia, and Janet had transferred here from Mississippi. Wow. She went 2 years to Baptist Girls' School in Mississippi. Yeah. Because I think her dad looked up in some catalog, and there was. And so that's Blue Mountain, Mississippi, all girls. And she didn't want to stay there. Yeah. So she went 2 years there.
2 years there.
And then she came here and got a bachelor's degree. And then after we got married, she finished a master's degree in art. Yeah. And it's a pretty good school in art. And she was dating the music guy at Memorial. And I don't know what happened to him. I think he was not a terrible thing. We were both very, very involved with Memorial Baptist before and after we were married. And but we got married in Union.
Yeah.
My folks were up there. He said he had never. Oliver's relatives, they're big German. My dad was very impressed. And see, then Susan was a little baby. And then I went up there to see where she lived. Went to church. I looked up front. She didn't know I was coming there. I went up, and they were remodeling the church, and they were having service in the basement. And there's Janet right up there on the front in the choir. And then another Janet came in. They look very much the same. And the age is not much difference. So that's where I met her sister, Marilyn.
Oh, okay.
And in Memorial in the Baptist church, and then that's where we got married. But they were still remodeling. So Susan was the flower girl. And she dropped some of her. There was water on the floor, and some of the church. It wasn't too fancy.
Now is it 1965?
I don't know. I'd have to count it up or look it up.
It was 1965, I think.
65.
Yeah. Because my dad was born in 66.
Okay.
Or, I think 66.
I quit the city.
Yeah, so you quit the city, you're working at the city.
And went into the business of being a surveying and civil engineer. And to build like you want to build a street like here, you have to draw it up, make pictures of it, and you take that to the city, and the city reviews it, and they approve it, and then you get to stake it out and build it. And so I shut down Oakwood Hills. You know where?
I think I know where it is. Yeah.
Okay, that's where we lived before we moved out.
On Old Mill Creek.
I guess we moved out, and we built a house. I don't remember when we built the house, but we moved with a pickup and a wagon, and Oliver helped me, and we moved to that house down there. And the street up there, they didn't bother getting the plans to the city.
Yeah.
And the contractor started grading it.
Yeah.
Because the owners, who had never built a subdivision in their life, they said, "You get that thing graded. You can't pave it if we don't get it graded." So the guy it was Richardson and Bass, and one of the owners of that company still alive. The other guy was he's passed away. Anyway, he's grading the road up, and it's this high in the middle, and on each side where there's a curb, place for a sidewalk, and curb and gutter.
Yeah.
It's way low, you know, because he knew that it wasn't time to grade the street.
Yeah.
Because he started grading the street, and they had a guy out of Jeff City, and he didn't know anything about designing roads. Mm-hmm. Well, they put the water main in, and then they started grading the streets, and they exposed the water main. Well, it's going to freeze and broke, of course. So he shut the job down. Mm-hmm. But I was the inspector for all the roads in town. Yeah. And they weren't building very many. Yeah. So the people that were owners, and there were about 5 of them, mm-hmm. and they were just going to make as much money as they can. Yeah. It's why you build subdivisions, yeah. Make money. So the guy who was kind of the boss and spoke for all those people, mm-hmm. he talked me into going into the business. Yeah. He says, you know how to do this. Mm-hmm. Nobody else does. Yeah. And that was true. And then also he worked for a company in St. Louis who made loans. Mm-hmm. So he got me to buy a house. And it was already existing. Yeah. They'd built about 5, and they hadn't sold any of them because they didn't have any street. And so that was our first house. Mm-hmm. And Drew lived in it. Mm-hmm. He had a little bitty little bitty bedroom. So we raised chinchillas in the basement. I don't think I want to talk about that though. It was an unsatisfactory kind of thing to do. Mm-hmm. But it was kind of fun, and I had a partner next door who was a veterinarian. And man, we were good because we had a vet on call, and we fed them good, and then Jimmy came to town, and Jimmy, he lived in the farmhouse, mm-hmm. but he helped us clean and feed the chinchillas.
So Jim Barnard, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess he started. No, he went to school at Baylor, mm-hmm. and then Oliver and Dorothy went to California, and he went for a year or 2 at Baylor, and then he transferred up here. Yeah. About the time they came back, mm-hmm. I think they were 2 years mm-hmm. out there. Then they moved to St. Louis. Mm-hmm. And
so you started your engineering business, correct? Around a little after that.
That was the way I started it. Yeah. Because we shut down, the city shut down the subdivision because mm-hmm. they couldn't pave the streets.
Yeah. So you started doing that.
And and the guy talked me into doing it. Mm-hmm. He was straightforward.
How many years did you do that?
Wow, I don't know.
A long time.
I bought 3 lots out by the airport, mm-hmm. and I built 3 buildings on it.
The old airport.
Yeah,
So out by where Cosmo is right now.
Is what?
Cosmo.
Yeah. And I operated out of the house there, and it was a pretty nice house, and I had I don't know, half a dozen people working for me. Actually, I started in the house up there on the first house on the right in Oakwood Hills, and but when I got that house at the airport, and also I was taking flying lessons at the same time, and that's kind of fun. And I was in the Aero Tigers. We owned 2 or 3 planes, and I soloed. I flew all the way to Houston, Missouri.
Yeah.
And then I built those 3. I was in a little house. I had an office back at the back, and there was a window right. Here's my desk, a window, and then if somebody sits there, we were discussing something, and they can see out this window, and they can hear a plane coming in, landing, or taking off, and you see them right out that window.
Wow.
And it was very traumatic. And then we had I had a garage, a 2-car garage. I think it's a 2-car garage, and I'd made it into a drafting room.
Yeah.
And then, but we had moved into the new office building, and I rented that place out to a guy who fixed televisions. And he fixed some televisions for a guy, and then he sold the televisions and didn't pay the guy who had stolen the deals. And I drove in one morning, and there was a couple of windows that had blown out of the front of this garage, and they're laying in the street. And the next thing that's up is my office in that building, and we were occupying that building. And the highway patrolman came up and looked all day in that building. There was several televisions in there, and they were all tore up, and they had a screen, and they picked everything up off the floor and put it in the screen. And I was over there talking to him. I said, "Well, do you figure out what happened here?" He says, "We just did it." And he picked it up, and there was a fuse. So it's where this guy, who was kind of a bad person, had kicked the window in. They didn't go in. They threw dynamite.
Blew it up.
And blew it up, and then I sold that building to a friend who was a mechanical engineer.
Yeah.
And but we moved into that building that I built for the engineering company, and then I hired an engineer. Up here there's a engineer he's a soils engineer.
Yeah.
Crockett
engineer now.
I hired his dad to go to work for me. He was working for the state of Missouri out of Jeff City, and they wanted him to go to Springfield, and he didn't want to go that far from home because he lived over between here and Mexico. and I had tried to get a guy who was working for the city to go to work for me, and he didn't want to do it. He later went his name was Jim Brush. He's went to open a surveying business on his own. But he says you get a hold of Crockett. I bet he would go to work for you because they're going to try to move him to Springfield. And I did, and that was my first engineer. And he moved into that building right there. We attended Memorial Baptist, and then we helped start the church.
Cornerstone.
The Cornerstone, yeah. And they went to MU.
Both of them.
And went to Rockbridge.
Cat likes my tripod.
Huh?
Cat's liking my tripods, right?
We drove a lot then because.
You went on a lot of trips.
Yes, we went to within 6 miles of being out of Mexico. What's the country?
Guatemala?
No.
Not Panama's south. Oh gosh. I took Spanish and learned all the countries down there.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, and I don't remember them. Oh, I know what you're talking about.
We drove all the way to all the way down, and it said whatever that town is or whatever the country is.
Yeah.
You go to the ruins.
Yeah.
You been to Tikal?
I have not been to Mexico.
Oh, you haven't been to Mexico?
So why did you get interested in Mexico and the Indians?
Yeah. You say, why did we?
Or why did you? Because I mean.
Well, the ruins. We went to Mexico City with Sam and Marilyn.
Yeah.
And Oliver and Dorothy.
Yeah.
And it's a big old town. And before that, we went on the trip to El Forte on a train trip.
So
went through all the deals.
That's what started your curiosity.
Yeah, that was probably true. And Marilyn and Sam orchestrated getting that trip, but we didn't take the kids on that trip. We thought they stayed in that house up there.
Yeah.
And we hired a lady who kind of
babysitter.
Maybe. Yeah, a little bit older.
Okay.
They didn't like her, but she took care of them while we were gone.
Yeah.
And we went on a nice big trip and no ruins.
Yeah.
But there were Indians who lived in that part of the area that were runners for the Aztecs, and they could run hundreds. They could just run all day long, and they were taking messages from one Indian group to another Indian group, and one of those groups were the Aztecs, and they didn't run that far, and so we kind of met that people a little bit, and then the people were making little baskets out of pine limbs off of pine trees.
Yeah.
And then they built nice houses and plastered it inside. But inside there is adobe, dirt.
Yeah.
And I'd ask about how much wages they made per day. Just laborers and the guys that made adobe blocks, they were not making much money.
Yeah.
$3 or $4 a day. If you were a skilled person, like electrician, like there's motels down there that tourists stay in, and then they made more money.
What's something memorable about your mom, Ruth?
What's that?
Anything memorable about Ruth, your mom? What was something special?
Well, she had to put up with a lot of Elmores.
Yeah.
And she's really bright. She said if she'd have gone to college, if she'd had the opportunity to go to college, she would have liked to have been a home ec teacher. She found out that there was a job in a school system, but way too late for her to mess with it. And she moved into the Jefferson Lodge.
Yeah.
And then she went to high school in Somerville, but only the last 2 years, I think. What was my first mission trip?
The one that was supposed to go to Nicaragua and ended up in Guatemala.
Where were we maybe going?
We were supposed to go to Nicaragua and they were having a
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
coup.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. So
Well,
we just got off the plane in Guatemala instead of
And that's
going to
how you went
Nicaragua. That was Woodcrest's first mission trip.
Oh, well, we had a lady who married a guy down
Yeah.
there.
One of the.
She's a.
I don't think she stayed married to him.
She's what is she? Same as. She's a nurse practitioner. No, she can.
No, she's a physician's assistant. I think.
Physician's assistant, yeah.
But the guy she married was from Peru, not from Guatemala.
No, he was from either Colombia or.
Peru. He was in the.
Peru.
He was a military policeman in Peru.
Okay.
But he didn't.
He came here and he didn't
want
learn.
to stay.
His language was Spanish and didn't fit.
Yeah, I lost track of that lady. I don't know where she is.
And she had gone to several trips, and we had to, and then she worked with a lady in Ohio, and this lady would take about 2 or 3 trips of people, and she had friends in Central America, and she would contact with those, and they'd say, well, okay, we're going to have so many people, and we're going to have to feed them and have to rent a car and that sort of thing. And when you kind of learn how to do stuff like that, you just kind of like to use your skills. And she was not really very organized. And the people. And the first trip that we made, the people that were Christian
Fellowship.
Christian Fellowship. Yeah. He went down there. He told them, I think they had 10 pastors. He was one of them. Yeah. And I want to go to South America. And, well, we'll pray about it. And they said, no, you can't go. You have to stay here. They said, no, I've already decided to go. So somebody gave him a pickup, and he put some of his furniture in the back of a pickup with a little shell on it. Not a big Chevrolet or Ford. It was like a Nissan or something.
Yeah, small Nissan.
Yeah, it was a little one. And he drove to Guatemala, and he didn't know anybody to knock on the door and say, well, here I am. And then we were organizing trips to go in and do kind of the church would bring some people in, and they had sores on their knees and things. And we did a lot of things like that, but just one a year. And then there was some people, actually, there was a doctor that was she was in the head of the social services for the state of Missouri, and she had gone down there, and they had asked people in this town what would be the thing that would help people who live in this town more than anything else. They wanted water. Yeah. And it's kind of hard to get water. Yeah. And they'd have to walk people who live in the town. They didn't have plumbing in the house. And they just wanted water to fix their food. Yeah. Well, they might have to walk 6 blocks to get a bucket of water. And so they recruited me to go down and find out where's the water coming from, and what are we going to do, and we're going to pick up samples and have it tested. And I went down, and I remember at night we were in the official's house, and they had water. Yeah. In that town. And I had gone up and looked at the water treatment plant. It was from the United States. I talked to them, says, well, do you sample this water and taste it? Yes. They send samples to the Capitol on a regular basis, just like we did here in Missouri. And we wanted to help them. So we went back to that town, and we stayed there. First time we went to the town, the guy who was a missionary who walked out of this church here in town and went down there, and he lived in the Capitol. But he didn't know where anything was in that town. Yeah. I kind of discovered where some of them were. And then we met Marilyn and her daughter. What's her name? Brookie. We met them. They'd been down there learning Spanish, and they'd been in a town. And when Sam and Marilyn went to South America, they went right through this town where we were talking to the people about their water. And we stayed in a real nice. The Methodists had built a bunch of motel rooms, and they could have conventions, and but they didn't have anybody. They didn't have any Methodists that lived down there, so we stayed in that place, and that was the first good place we stayed in. And Marilyn and Brooke were down the way, and I stayed with 2 other guys in a place, in a room, and we I couldn't sleep very well.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking of, and I'm thinking about a song. I could work up a little ditty of sing. So they were about 2 rooms down in another motel room that was just like the one we were in, and I was there with the pastor and somebody. There were 3 of us in that room. So I walked down outside their window. The window was up high for privacy.
Yeah.
And I sang a little song to them. It says, and the song went, we don't drink the water in Guatemala.
What would you like to drink, speaking of that, for lunch? Burger and
Yeah, surprised me. We don't, and they're in there, and they're,
Cook, yeah.
it's kind of late in the morning, and they're waking up.
Mm-hmm.
We don't drink the water in Guatemala porque we just don't do it. And we don't flush the paper in Guatemala porque, see, you don't flush the paper because the pipes are only about this big and it's stopped up. And Brooke still probably remembers that song. And so that was, and we had told them that we're going to meet in a certain hotel. And they got there 15 minutes before we did. And we were coming from the United States. And that was fun. And that was the first really real trip. And we were going to test the water.
Yeah.
And they were doing that. So they were ahead of us. And that's the end of that day.